You might not want to talk about 2023 anymore, but I've still got a little bit more that I want to discuss. And what was missing? What was missing for the Georgia Bulldogs in 2023 that look, I mean, we just saw two examples of how to win a national championship from a Georgia Bulldog perspective, right? 2021 and 2022. We saw two different they were not the same team. Obviously there's some carryover, but we saw two different teams win the national championship. Obviously, in 21, you had one of the best defenses of all time. And those numbers show for itself. I've got a few numbers pulled up that I want to discuss. In 2022, I think that it was a mixture of everything, and you still had superstars on both sides of the football. In 2023, it did feel like a minor step back was taken, and it felt like that from a defensive perspective for the most part. I want to pull up even more numbers as I'm thinking of this off the top of my head, but it was the defense. Well, that was the biggest difference to me in 23. But I thought that the offense at times was more productive than in the past. There were different aspects to it. I think that this 2023 offense got a raw deal in terms of injuries, so we didn't really get to see it at full force for much time at all, really. I don't think that we saw Georgia's offense in full force. And, we never really saw the defense in completely full force either. When you talk about missing a guy like Jamon Dumas-Johnson, who's, a longtime starter for Georgia at that point, you're missing him. You're missing one of your defensive backs. There were injuries for Georgia on defense as well. But it just felt like the defense couldn't strangle teams as much. It couldn't choke you out. That's the way that it happened in 21. And to an extent, there were moments like that in 2022 where the defense showed out. And the Tennessee game is a prime example. Georgia didn't have a game this year like that where, yes, obviously the offense was good enough to get the job done against the Volunteers in 22. But I think about that defense, and I think about Jalen Carter and the plays he made. I think about Javon Bullard and the plays he made. Having a guy like that be that impactful, more specifically in the front seven. Obviously, I know that Javon Bullard was on this 2023 team and that he made an impact on this 2023 team. But I'm once again talking about in the front seven. I think it's hard to win without a good one. How many times have we seen national championship teams not have a good front seven? Michigan had a great one this past season. Georgia had a good one. Georgia had a fantastic one. Alabama had a pretty good one. 2019 LSU, not as good as maybe some of the others, but had plenty of studs in it, and has a linebacker that's playing to be in a Super Bowl and Patrick Queen in this coming week. So had those types of studs. I think about Georgia losing the national championship in 2017. I think about both of those front sevens between Alabama and Georgia. Ridiculous, right? So I think an elite guy in the front seven that, look, I think they have elite guys, or at least guys that can be elite, but didn't have one that actually did elite things over the course of a season. And I think that is one of the biggest things that the 2023 Georgia team was missing. Will it have that in 2024 is also a good question, especially with a little bit more turnover. Ryan Curley from Dawg Post talking about possibly the thing that I think, I think there's a lot of reasons why Georgia didn't win in this past year, right? I do think that Georgia was the best team in college football, and I think it didn't win the national championship. Those two things can both be true at the same time. And there are a few things that factor into that. You could talk about injuries. You could talk about possibly a mismanagement of injuries. You could talk about straight up coaching between Kirby and Nick Saban. Talking about not executing when the time matters. But what is something that Georgia clearly wasn't as proficient at, and it was the front seven. Getting to the quarterback, a little bit of it. The numbers don't completely back up what I'm saying, right? Because I've got some sack percentages, right? This is by teamrankings.com. And you look at Georgia having a ridiculous one, an 8.93, right? That's not even the highest that you can get when you're talking about a sack percentage. Georgia had 8.93 in the 21 season. In 22, that dropped to 6.55, and in 23, it was around 6.65. It actually went up. See, and this is what I'm talking about. It's not backing up. That is a percentage number, sacks per snap kind of deal, right? And not every season, not every game is created equally in calculating numbers like that. But it just felt like there wasn't as much pressure this year, right? Nobody on this Georgia team had more than 4.5 sacks. Five. Jalen Walker ended up with 5 as the season went on. So those things changed when you get the Orange Bowl in there. Jalen Walker's not out there all the time. In 21 they had a unit where a bunch of guys were able to get there, and that's feeding off of each other. But these past couple years, it felt like there just hasn't been as much pressure. It felt like it's dropping off. They had an absolutely elite guy in Jalen Carter on that defensive line in 2022. And the Tennessee game that I'm going to reference, I'm going to continue to reference whenever I need to, is a prime example of what one player can do. He was extremely disruptive in other games, obviously, but when you talk about taking over moments of one and causing some serious problems, you can talk about that game, right? In a top 5 matchup, and a top 3 matchup between two teams that were both ranked number 1 in 2 different polls in that game. The expectation was that Michael Williams might take a step forward. The expectation was that Jalen Walker might take a step forward. The expectation was that Georgia had this elite linebacker room in Jamon Dumas-Johnson, Jalen Walker, Smile Mondon. Obviously, the guys behind them are really good too, going to play a lot more in 2024. It just felt like there wasn't a lot of steps forward taken. It kind of felt like Georgia's defense was stagnant and took a step back. It seemed like the linebackers, I know that there were some injuries that Smile Mondon was dealing with at the beginning of the season. Obviously, Jamon Dumas-Johnson got hurt as the season went on. They were not near as productive as they were the previous year. They just weren't. I don't know what changed. The defensive line, Nazir Stackhouse and Warren Brinson, weren't as impactful as Jalen Carter and Nazir Stackhouse. Missing a Nolan Smith mattered a lot for Georgia. How much of this is based on the fact that Georgia rotates so much that they have a bunch of different defensive sets? Maybe that can make it more difficult than other times to get the quarterback and create sacks. Yes. Now, I'm not just talking about sacks. I'm talking about just absolutely feel the heat type of pressure. I feel like Georgia a little bit teetered off in that this year. It seemed that way. You want to hear another number? And this is a number that was brought up by Kirby. I don't have the exact number, but it's under 3 seconds. Whatever this number is. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. During those 2-3 seconds, that is how fast the ball is getting thrown out. And Kirby talked about that earlier in the year. He talked about that, I believe, in August. Maybe it was back last spring. The concept of how they're getting played differently, right? A lot more is being designed to where you can get the ball out in a couple of seconds, and that affects sack numbers, right? So the numbers for this particular conversation, it can't always justify a topic, especially in one of the ones I presented with you, where the sack percentage actually went up by 0.1 over the course from 22 to 23. But they're getting played differently. You got guys like Jalen Milroe out there who can make things happen with his legs. But what happened in that game? It felt like there just wasn't enough pressure in the moments that there needed to be. He was able to get outside the pocket. He had time to throw. He was able to get the ball to Isaiah Bond. So you look at example games like that, and it's like, okay, well, we know what one of the problems is it just needs to get better in the front seven, because the defensive backs can only hold on for so long, especially when you're playing against NFL caliber receivers. It's the problem that we've seen in almost every game that Georgia's either struggled in or lost over the last few years. Lack of pressure in the 2021 SEC Championship. What did Bryce Young do? He torched Georgia. 4 total touchdowns, like 400 total yards. Jamison Williams was out there catching streaks. He was out there catching slants and taking to the house. Bryce Young had time to throw. C.J. Stroud made things happen, right? Can't finish on the quarterback. What's he going to do? He ends up throwing for almost 400 yards and 4 touchdowns in that Peach Bowl. Jalen Milroe did not have the statistical game that those guys did against Georgia. But what did he do? When those moments counted, he got outside and he made the throw when it mattered. All I'm saying is there's a common theme in the games that Georgia's either struggled in or lost. It's a lack of pressure on the quarterback, something that maybe we're measuring against something that's just too high, because in recent memory, you think about what they did in 2021, and everything's being measured against that. So maybe part of that's a little bit unfair, but it's definitely food for thought. Thank you for watching. Links down below for the newsletter.